everyone. Good morning, everyone. Glad you could all join us. I would like to welcome you to session 10 of the Anderson webinar series. I would like to apologize for the late start. We had a few technical issues, but we are good to go from here on out. Pricing implications for businesses in Middle East and Africa. Now, 2020 was a very interesting year because the COVID-19 pandemic unexpectedly came up and it had significant impact on nations, on businesses, on economies. Now, specifically for related party transactions or for group entities, it has become a very important issue for multinational enterprises to understand how the disruptions to the world, to the economy, to business last year can actually affect their related party transactions and to look at ways to mitigate whatever risks or issues may come up. That's why we decided to have this webinar to educate our audience about these issues and the ways to mitigate these potential issues. Now, this webinar, because it is such a topical issue, it has attracted participants across the Africa and Middle Eastern region, and we had over 300 registered participants. So we expect a very full house and good deliberations. In fact, we have a very seasoned array of panelists to help us properly dissect the topic of today. But before delving into the main discussions, before delving into the panel discussions, I think it will be good for us to actually have a short presentation, like a background or an introduction to the topic of the day, explaining what happened last year, explaining why it is actually important for group entities to understand the TP implications of COVID-19 for their business. So I will be starting the presentation now. It's just a few slides just to run us through a quick background as to what has happened. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, COVID-19 unexpectedly broke out last year around March, and it was declared a pandemic. And the pandemic has had a lot of impacts on businesses. These impacts have had implications for individuals, you and I. It has had implications for companies, for businesses, people running their business, their everyday activities. And it has also had implications for nations as a whole. It has had implications for nations as a whole. So some of the general implications that it has had is what we have listed here. So we have restriction of movement of goods and services. This was the very first thing that happened when the pandemic hit. Because of the need to curb the spread of the pandemic, there was almost immediate restriction of movement of goods, services, and also individuals. Now, what this means is that for people that have to commute for work, everybody had to work from home. We had to transition to online remote working or online working. So there was a lot of work from home that actually started with the COVID-19 pandemic, with the outbreak of the pandemic. Now for businesses, where you're unable to move your goods, where you require some kind of products to actually, whether for manufacturing or for distribution, some kind of restriction would obviously affect your business. So this is actually a major issue that was brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, this led to limited commercial operations. Like I've said, if you have restriction of movement, in fact, restricted to essential workers in most countries, you would have limited operations. When you have limited operations, when you have people not being able to move around to purchase your goods, where you're unable to produce, there would be a decline in demand. So as you can see, the pandemic brought up different implications, and each of them seems to be interconnected. And it seems to have very negative impact on business generally. If you look at increased costs, because products were not moving so much, because people were not able to move, a few things became more expensive. So what it means is that whether you're an individual or you're a company, you would actually have to purchase things at a higher cost. For some people, unfortunately, it led to some form of pay cuts or staff layoffs. So this was actually a very major issue for companies to deal with last year in 2020. And some companies are still dealing with this in 2021. Also, there were cash flow issues. Now, where you are unable to get your normal money from your business activities, you realize that you want to stay afloat as a company. You want to continue to run your businesses. But because you're not making revenue, or you're not making as much revenue as you had budgeted, you realize that you actually need more financing. So there was an increase in debt financing. And in a lot of cases, this debt financing came from related parties, because in that situation, in your situation of need, you realize that some of the fastest ways for you to get extra money is to go to your related parties. So this led to, in some cases, increase in intercompany debt finances. Also, financing, I mean. Also, there was an increase in the demand for remote services. As you can see, we're having this webinar virtually. We are not all in one room because we have to ensure that we abide by the COVID regulations. But prior to 2020, prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, while webinars were held, it wasn't actually the norm to have virtual events like this. So this means that for a lot of companies also, they had to actually move their operations online. And for physical operations, it could have meant that people had to close down a few offices, since most people are working online. People had to lay off a few staff since they did not need people to be going into the office. So there were various implications for taxpayers. And also we had significant supply chain disruptions. And this flows from the restriction in movement of goods and services. Where you're unable to move, where there's some kind of restriction, some kind of embargo on you moving your goods, you realize that your supply chain actually gets disrupted because you're unable to get the products that you actually need to either manufacture, to either distribute to your final consumers. So these were some of the general issues that came about with the outbreak of COVID-19. But since we're talking today about transfer pricing, the question is, how have these general issues translated into transfer pricing issues that taxpayers actually need to be aware of? So some of the issues from a transfer pricing perspective, and I'll just spend a few minutes talking about this, are supply chain disruptions. So like I mentioned earlier, we had 2020 brought a bit of supply chain disruptions. Now, for related parties, what we realize is that because of the interconnectedness of multinational enterprises, you realize that for some companies, they actually get their various products from related parties. So what it means is that you purchase a transaction from a related party, you have agreed a certain price, or you have certain targets or certain plans, supply chain plans already in place. But because of this disruption, your related party is actually unable to meet the end of to meet the terms that have been agreed before. So what it means is that you are disrupted in your business. So either you're unable to produce, you're unable to supply, or whatever it is that this company does. Because one entity is unable to move goods, the other entity that is reliant on this original entity finds out that there's some kind of disruption to their business. So this was a major TP challenge that related parties had to face in 2020, and some related parties are still facing in 2021. And of course, this leads to one of the most important implications for taxpayers: erosion of revenue and profit margins. Like I mentioned when I was talking about the other slides, there was a decrease in demand. There was restriction in movement of goods and services. Now, what it means is that for companies that probably would have budgeted to meet a target markup, to make target revenue during the year, once you're unable to move your goods, once customers are unable to purchase goods because of the focus on just essential products at a particular point, you realize that there's a very big possibility that you would not meet your target revenue or profit margins. Now, where you are a multinational enterprise and you're conducting business with your related parties, what you actually find out is that your profitability is actually very heavily dependent on your other related party. So where you have a related party agreement and you've agreed to pay a certain amount, you've agreed to a certain arm's length price in prior years, you realize that because of the disruptions to business that COVID-19 has brought up, you're actually unable to meet those target revenues and meet those target profits, which in itself is a problem from a related party point of view, from a transfer pricing point of view, because the expectation is that your prices should be at arm's length. But before I go too far, I know that these are some of the things that we're going to discuss during the panel session. Also, another thing that really affected related parties was increase for debt financing. Because of the need of companies to stay afloat, because of the need for companies to find other ways to shore up their finances as a company to ensure that working capital continues to move. They needed more money, they needed debt financing. And one of the easiest ways to actually get debt financing in time of needs, in urgent situations, is to go to your related parties. Now, this comes with its own transfer pricing issues because you have to find out at what price should I actually give out this loan, considering the implications or considering the impact COVID-19 has had on our business. Should I be paying interest for these loans? Can my business actually afford this? What would independent parties actually do if they were in similar situations? So these are some of the questions that related parties had to start thinking about because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the fourth thing we're going to highlight here, changes to business models. Now, we understand that COVID-19 brought, like I mentioned earlier, work from home, virtual things. Now, because of the disruption to supply chain, because of sometimes the switch from physical offices to virtual working, a lot of companies had to change their business models a bit. Now, understanding that the TP policies would have been based on prior agreed business models or structures, there would be need for companies to actually review their TP policies to ensure that everything is in line with the restructuring, even if the restructuring is actually temporary. So these issues and more actually were burning issues last year, early this year, and this led the OECD to release a guidance on the application of the arm's length principle in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the idea is to give taxpayers something they can look at, something they can read and understand. Having highlighted all these various issues that have come up, it's good for us to have some kind of guidance that helps people navigate whatever issues might come up in terms of transfer pricing, whether it has to do with taxpayers and compliance or tax authorities and analyzing the documents that will be provided to them by taxpayers. So this is the reason why we are having this webinar today. We are here to discuss this guidance, to explain to the taxpayers why they need to understand the implications of TP or of COVID-19 for their businesses from a related party point of view, and also give them some kind of pointers as to what they could do to mitigate these challenges. So at this point, without further ado, I think it would be good for us to delve into this panel session. But before I delve into the panel session, I think it would be good for me to introduce our panelists. We have quite a number of panelists, and like I mentioned, they're seasoned professionals. They're all very experienced. And in fact, our panelists cut across the region that we're covering today, so the Middle East and Africa. And the idea is for us to get diverse opinions from different jurisdictions to understand how this issue is affecting different people and how we can actually address this. In fact, we have two members of tax authorities also with us to give us the perspective of the tax authorities on this particular topic. So without further ado, I will introduce the panelists now. So first up, we have Ifeoluwa Oyedeji. Ife is the Group Tax and Compliance Manager of Flour Mills of Nigeria. Thank you very much for joining us, Ife. We have Moses Budana. Moses is the head transfer pricing unit of the Ghana Revenue Authority. Thank you for joining us, Moses. For Mustafa Issa, we have Mustafa Issa also. He's the group head international tax transfer pricing audit of the Federal Inland Revenue Service, our very own tax authority here in Nigeria. Thank you very much for being here with us, Mustafa. Nice to have you. We also have Solomon Choge. He's the head of sales of Royalty Range Database. Thank you for joining us, Solomon. So from the consulting end, we have Kevin Kian, PhD. He's the managing director and the global transfer pricing leader, Anderson Global, USA. We also have Nitin Mirang. He's a partner, international tax and transfer pricing, Nanja Anderson, India. Thank you very much for joining us, Nitin and Kevin. We have Jacqueline Pett. She's a director of tax in Anderson, South Africa. We also have someone from Kuwait with us. We have Ranjit Patil. He's a director with Anderson, Kuwait. And of course, we have our very own Joshua Banko, PhD. He's a partner and global transfer pricing co-leader with responsibilities for Africa, Middle East, and Africa and the Middle East. But he works from Anderson, Nigeria here. So thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much for honoring this invitation and for us having these discussions. I look forward to very interesting and enlightening discussions. But before I ask my first question, I would just like to remind the audience that there is a question and answer box. There's an option for you to send in your questions. So during this meeting or during this webinar, if at any point you have any questions, right, or anything you want us to clarify, right, please put it in the question and answer box and we will try our best to actually take your questions. So thank you very much for joining us. Now, to the question, Josh and Kevin, actually, I think both of you can give us some good insight as to this. We've had the general background into why the COVID-19 pandemic was actually, it had implications for businesses generally, for economies generally. I think it would be good for us to delve into the TP issues brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first question really, starting with Josh, is what are the TP issues brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic?
All right, thanks, Bisola, for the very nice and detailed intro. In order not to repeat what you said, in responding to this question, I'll try to make it as practical as possible. We all are aware of the devastating impact of COVID-19 on economies across the globe. And because of that, it also adversely impacted businesses. But when it comes to businesses, there was a disproportionate impact. In other words, whereas a significant number of sectors were adversely impacted, there were a few sectors which weren't as hurt. For example, if you look at Nigeria and you look at the telecom sector, actually they've done pretty well during this COVID period. Same can be said for some fintech businesses and even some banks. All right, so clearly there's been a disproportionate impact. So we cannot paint all industries with the same brush. But what is important is that because some industries were hard hit and therefore they really suffered financially, it's important to understand the implications for transfer pricing, especially for financial year 2020. The good news is it's not only taxpayers that have recognized these challenges. Tax administrators across the globe, as part of the inclusive framework with the OECD, also recognize this. So if you look at the guidance that OECD has brought forward, there were 137 member countries that are part of the inclusive framework, which includes Nigeria and other African countries and Middle East countries that actually came up with this guidance. So it's very comprehensive and I hope we all embrace it. So what are some of the TP issues? Let me take, for example, a business in Nigeria in either the trade or manufacturing sector that is highly dependent on importation in order to manufacture locally or to sell finished products directly to third parties in its market. Let's assume that they do, the related party happens to be in China, where the manufacturing occurs. So the manufacturing entity in China either manufactures an input, which would then be used to manufacture the finished product in Nigeria, or a finished product that it sells to its related party here for distribution in the Nigerian market. We remember the first quarter of 2020 actually was when China had to go through a lockdown to contain this COVID-19 and pandemic in China. That led to significant supply chain disruptions. So if you happen to be either a manufacturing entity here in Nigeria or a distributor, you are going to be adversely impacted because of that lockdown, because of the supply chain disruption. Without the supply of either your major raw material or your finished product, that is going to have an adverse impact in terms of your revenue and giving your cost, your bottom line. So as Bisola said, if during normal times, there's an expectation of you making some normal, decent, positive margins. If you find yourself in these two sectors and you are adversely impacted, you're going to realize margins that are significantly lower than what you declared in the past years. In some cases, you could even incur a loss. And that has TP implications because when we talk about transfer pricing, although we focus on the price, ultimately, is an allocation of profits between related parties. All right. So if the group as a whole or those involved in the related party transaction are making losses, it stands to reason that there's a high probability that part of the loss will be passed down to the local entity here. So this is some of the things you need to think about proactively and ask yourself, how do I present a compelling case to the tax administrators so that they will understand that the loss that I made for FY 2020 has nothing to do with transfer pricing, but has more to do with the adverse impact of an exogenous factor, which is the COVID pandemic. So those are some of the responsibilities we have as taxpayers, because the burden of proof depends on the jurisdiction you find yourself and the regulations in that jurisdiction. The burden of proof could be on you, the taxpayer, and it's your responsibility to then find ways to deal with it. So that's an example of a low margin effect. As Bisola has also said, there are instances where, because of cash flow challenges, it was important that you borrow from either a third party or your related party. Where there's significant borrowing at a time that you had to negotiate favorable terms, such as moratorium periods, that you wouldn't have gotten during normal times. Once again, this could be of concern for tax administrators, and you need to be in a position to explain why you got those favorable terms, all right, especially if you happen to be the lender, because your tax administrator will expect your related party to pay that interest, over on a periodic basis. So those are some of the issues you need to think about. So if you have a Nigerian headquartered company that lends to a subsidiary in, let's say, Ghana, and that company is expected to make interest payments to the Nigerian parent company, and because of the favorable terms, they don't make such interest payments, how would the Nigerian tax authorities treat that? Because there's an expectation that there should be an interest payment coming to the Nigerian entity. Another situation we've seen, once again, the risk is going to be on the service provider's point of view, is that some related parties actually couldn't meet their obligations of paying, let's say, management service fees or royalties to their related parties. This once again is an example of the extraordinary nature of financial year 2020. How do you explain that your inability to make such a payment, all right, is actually arm's length in nature? These are all things that we need to think about. The last bit I'm going to talk about, so that I can leave room for Kevin to also add his views, will be the case where you have to demonstrate to the tax authorities that the margins you earned or the related party transactions you engage in that you have to make payments meet the arm's length principle. Depending on the methodology that you've used in the past to make such a demonstration, all right, you need current data. So if you were using one of the most commonly used methodologies, which is the transaction net margin method, TNMM, where you are testing the margins of one of the entities involved in the related party transactions, all right? And for FY 2020, you happen to be in a loss position. You want your comparable independent companies that you're going to use to test whether your loss-making position is reasonable, to also have financial information that covers the same period that you are testing. But what we see is that usually these database providers do not have the most current data on time. There's a lag effect. So if we're talking about financial 2020, depending on the database you're using and depending on the jurisdiction that it's covering, your most current data could be FY 2018 or at best FY 2019. So if you happen to be in a jurisdiction where there's a timeliness in terms of when you prepare your documentation, all right, and such data is not available, then that's a huge challenge. For example, if I look at Moses's jurisdiction, Ghana recently passed a revised TP regulation. In there, taxpayers are supposed to file their local file, and this should be done along with the file of your TP returns. And this is to be done 4 months after your financial year end as a taxpayer. So if you're December 31st year end, you should do this by April 30th. I can confidently tell you that if you go into these databases, all right, and you have to prepare a contemporaneous TP documentation for FY 2020 before April 30th of 2021, there's the high likelihood that you wouldn't find comparable companies with FY 2020 financial data. So how do I perform an analysis to tell the returns that a company earned for FY 2020 when that data is not available and I'm supposed to file my local file by April 30th? that poses a huge challenge. The question is, will tax administrators be willing to make room for such an extraordinary situation, and therefore maybe allow for a resubmission when such data becomes available, especially if you cannot resort to a different methodology that will yield an equally reliable result? So those are some of the pertinent questions we need to answer. In the case of Nigeria, you are supposed to actually prepare your TP documentation contemporaneously. That is within the 6 months after your financial year end. So if you're at 31st December year end, this is supposed to be done before June 30th. However, the difference between the Nigeria's case and the Ghana's case is taxpayer doesn't have to submit the local file to the tax authorities. However, they are supposed to only submit when the tax authorities make a request for it, and they have only 3 weeks, 21 days to make such a submission. So in that case, you can see a little bit of a leeway. In other words, if by June 30th, we don't have that financial data available for independent companies for FY 2020, all right? And FIRS has not made such a request for my FY 2020 TP documentation. I can always update my TP documentation prior to FIRS making such a request. But that will be dependent on when FIRS makes such a request. If FIRS was to make such a request in July, for example, and by that time we don't have such a financial data, the same challenge that will face the taxpayer in Ghana will also be facing similar challenges in Nigeria. So these are some of the challenges that this COVID-19 pandemic has thrown to taxpayers. And I think it's timely and apt that OECD has come up with this guidance for both taxpayers and tax administrators to guide us through the process of navigating through these uncertainties. And my hope is that through today's discussion, taxpayers will be well informed as to how best to deal with some of these challenges. And secondly, tax administrators will be able to embrace these challenges and be more flexible in trying to find ways to work with taxpayers to ensure that they present documentation that are highly reliable and can defend their position because of the uncertainties COVID-19 has thrown out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh. And I think your key point, flexibility and adaptability, is really required to handle the situations that came up last year. Kevin, I don't know if you have a few words to add to this.
Josh, you made so many good points. I don't want to have to repeat all of them because there's so many. Maybe just to underscore a few key ones that you made. Josh was saying that transfer pricing is all about the allocation of profit. It's the allocation of profit or losses, right? Any results within a controlled group of companies. This necessarily means that in terms of how the allocation is made, one should understand what the relative contributions are of each of the related parties within the controlled group. Okay, and this is usually normally a subjective exercise. But one of the key points, another key point that I think you can take away from what Josh was saying is that, just because something is subjective, it doesn't mean it should be arbitrary. It should be motivated by how the business actually runs, right? And so where possible, the allocation, which should reflect relative contributions to the value chain, should also reflect how the business actually runs. And so what we're going to be talking about today, I think you're going to hear from a lot of the panelists, are practical and concrete ideas, measures that taxpayers can take in order to explain in layman's terms, practical terms, how relative contributions should be explained and measured within a value chain, and what kinds of data or information maybe taxpayers should proactively assemble in order to make the narrative that will be reflected in the documentation clear and easy to capture.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin and Josh. Basically, what we've just highlighted are the issues that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought up from a TP point of view, and how important it is for taxpayers and tax authorities alike to be flexible, to understand these issues and look for ways to handle them. Now, we've heard from the experts about the impact of COVID-19. It would be good for us to also hear from the taxpayer, and we have Ife here. Ife, can you tell us how has the COVID-19 actually affected businesses from a taxpayer's point of view? What has this pandemic done to business?
All right, thank you, Bisola. Yes, so from a business perspective, the COVID-19 has been very disruptive. It's unprecedented. For instance, the COVID-19 pandemic brought about massive devaluation of the naira. For instance, there was a drop in the crude oil price at the wake of the pandemic, which led to spike in foreign exchange. At about February, March last year, the US dollars was at 360 and it consistently rose from 360 to 387, 435. And today we're basically exchanging naira to a dollar for 490 naira. That is really massive and it has significantly affected business. It has impacted on our cost of doing business, and a lot of companies are trying to keep afloat. Also, in terms of customs for the importations that we've had, there's been increase in government rates from about 326 to 381 naira. So that's a lot on businesses. Also, businesses have had to provide transportation for their staff, the production staff, to minimize the spread and to minimize the spread of the infection. So companies have had to provide buses, transportation for employees, which was not the case before. Also, the alternate work arrangement has greatly impacted on capacity. So we find alternate work arrangements, we find people working from home, and then companies have had to replace desktops with laptops. So there's been significant increase in cost of doing business. Also, to give example on the supply chain disruption, like Josh mentioned, to import from China takes about 40 days. And then in addition to that, we have ships being quarantined on the sea for another 2 weeks, just to ensure that the crew members are free from COVID before the ship is allowed to berth. That's also created huge costs for the business, and then also it created a lot of lag in delivery, which also impacted on production. You find some companies having delays and not being able to meet up with demands. Also, we also have local vendors consolidating on request because of social distancing. They're not able to respond quickly to orders as they should, and that has also created delays. We have farmers, they've had to curtail production, and so all those have also created local delays, which has led to price increase both for companies and for consumers, which has led to high cost of buying food, pharmaceuticals, and all others. And also, when there was closure, there's some companies that when you shut down to come up, it's actually very expensive. You need to have an entire overhaul of your machines, so those costs have been significant and it's been challenging, but we thank God that businesses are still surviving. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ife. It's very good to hear from someone who is in the system how this pandemic has actually affected businesses, and not just businesses. You mentioned the issue of cost price increase affecting consumers also. So thank you very much for this. From an Indian perspective, meeting, if you can just give us in a few minutes, in 1 or 2 minutes, just explain how the pandemic also affected businesses in India. We would appreciate that.
Sure. So first of all, I resonate completely to what Ife's points. That's a good perspective coming in from the company itself. But as pandemic and as the life phenomena, someone's loss would be someone's gain. So some industries did get a lot of boost even in this time. But looking at demand and supply equilibrium, it actually swung like a pendulum. When the demand was impacted, say due to the lockdown, the supply was disturbed due to the supply chain disruptions and restrictions in many countries. And during this lockdown, industries like, or rather sectors like aviation, tourism, hospitality, real estate, automobile, chemical, shipping, logistics, all these had a significant downfall. When we see that how they're getting ways to the new normal, they will take some time in getting back to the pre-COVID revenues. And on the other side, if you look at sectors like IT, pharma, education, technology, uh, electronics, fintech companies, the pandemic did have a good impact. But let's take a deeper look into the supply chain. It has a lot of focal points, which needs to be operational simultaneously. Factories have to start, logistic companies need to carry the supplies, the dealers have to be active, the retailers have to be back, open their shops, and more importantly, the consumers should have the appetite to buy. Any of the focal point which is missing here would break the supply chain. And what happened in the lockdown is that many countries had the lockdown so that they can control the pandemic, and the pandemic impact can be limited. This impacted the local movement, and there was a complete breakdown of the supply chain. From an India point of view, coming specifically here, for India, one of the major suppliers, not only for India but for the world, has been China. Let it be either a finished product or a raw material or a semi-finished good. China has been the major supplier, and the impact that we have had due to the lockdown in China and many other suppliers is that there is, the trade impact of the corona virus pandemic in India is estimated at $348 million. And India, which was one of the soaring countries, is now among the top 10 economies most affected by the manufacturing slowdown in China. Uh, there has been a factor which says move the manufacturing out of China. The world is following a China plus one strategy. The Indian government has also come out, with a lot of incentives, a lot of schemes, make in India. But I believe everything will take a lot of time. The supply and demand equilibrium has still not settled down well. It'll take some more time into settling it out. 2020 has just gone by. 21, we are seeing second wave coming in many countries. So it'll be still time when, once we have all that. Definitely the vaccine which is being rolled out will give a lot more buoyancies, and we see a lot of businesses coming up towards the end of 21 back to the pre-COVID times.
Thank you very much, Nitin. It's really interesting to see how this pandemic has affected everyone, not just from my limited view here in Nigeria, but also seeing how it affects people in India. Thank you very much for this. Now, to the tax authorities, we've heard a lot. We've heard from our consultants, we've heard from the businesses, we've also heard from people's experiences in other continents. Now, the question to the tax authorities is this: will the tax authorities be willing to adopt this guidance that has been provided by the OECD for years affected by the pandemic? We understand that the OECD is works in an advisory capacity, but will the tax authorities actually be willing to accept this guidance, considering the compelling arguments that we've heard of the impacts of the COVID-19 for businesses? So I think, Moses, if you can take this question.
Thanks, Bishola, for this question. Yes, the question is that will the tax authorities be willing to embrace the guidance provided? What I would say is that obviously the guidance developed by the OECD has been developed to address a need created by the pandemic. And as indicated by Josh, the guidance was prepared with the input from the tax authorities. And while the businesses are not doing well and crying, we all feel the impact of COVID. And for that matter, it comes with certain challenges. And for that matter, it may impact the pricing between related parties and obviously even with third parties. So I will say that yes, the pandemic with all the challenges that it comes with will affect businesses, for that matter, the pricing of goods between related parties. So the guidance, as has been discussed and mentioned by Joss and other presenters, has come to kind of give guidance on some of the challenges that has been brought up by the pandemic in terms of related party dealings. And economy of various countries was hard hit, and not only the countries that actually fell it, but I think almost every economy was affected, and transfer pricing goes around economies. And looking at the specifics, some of the guidance that has been provided by the OECD, I will say that just to mention a few of them, if you look at, there's a guidance on under what circumstance will the arrangement between related parties be modified by the pandemic, because you had gone into an arrangement based on certain circumstances. And for example, the source of raw materials could not be supplied, and you had to change your business strategy and even shut down. So obviously, this is an area that we'll have to look at it. It's a case-by-case basis. Then you have the issues around the use of more than one transfer pricing methodology, or even the need to change a transfer pricing methodology. I think the guidelines around these areas are things that the tax authorities cannot close our eye to. You talk of companies loss making that arise as a result of the pandemic. There are certain industries that totally shut down. You have to look at it. And the case of loss making companies, that are you able to use loss making companies as comparable? I mean, the guidance has made commentary around this, and obviously the tax authorities need to look at these things. Then you look at allocation of exceptional costs arising from the pandemic. You need to look at that. How do you apportion such costs among related parties to the extent that it affected the parties? Then price adjustment mechanisms, that commentary and guidance has been provided on that. So I think obviously we'll have to look at it and see under what circumstance can we apply this guidance. Though not binding, but obviously the guidelines is written for both tax authorities and the taxpayers and the business community. And there are other areas like the approaches to address information deficiencies. There's a huge gap in terms of information, and without information, transfer pricing cannot thrive. And as indicated by Joyce, in our case, we have a very tight deadline for taxpayers to comply. There are information gaps. There are companies that are still working offside. And because of the way our economies evolve around hard paper, it is difficult. So I think the guidance is quite useful. I looked at it when it was released, and obviously a lot of tax authorities will obviously will take guidance on some of the guidance that has been provided. And I think it's quite a useful document. And most of my colleagues in other jurisdictions will look at it and see how it will apply. Else you have to look at it to minimize litigations, obviously. And it is not a one-sided guidance that has been provided. So I allow my colleague, Mustafa, if you have something. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Moses. That's very reassuring to hear. Mustafa, I think Nigerian taxpayers will be very interested to hear what you have to say. So please, in a few minutes, give us your comments.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I've had a little challenges with my connection earlier, but I'm back now. It's been an interesting conversation and very enlightening. The question, I believe, is whether we're going to abide by the guidance, additional guidance given by the EC. Of course, the answer is yes. And to make it more specific is to say that, as the guidance noted, it is not an expansion or revision of the original guideline, the OECD 2017 transparency guideline. It's just giving additional guidance that relates to a fact pattern that is pandemic related. So traditionally, if you engage in related party transactions, you're expected to demonstrate, make reasonable efforts to ensure that you do not misprice, that is, your prices are in line with what independent parties will price. So that is the traditional arm's length concept. It doesn't change in the pandemic. The only difference is that the circumstances has changed in possibly a negative manner that will impact, for instance, a subsidiary negatively due to, as you mentioned earlier, disruption of their supply chains and reduction in demand, which will, of course, may have depressed margins. But it's important to note that The taxpayers have to be careful in, in ensuring that the documentations are supported by, sufficient facts to demonstrate that a particular subsidiary has impacted and is the pandemic that is a result of those losses. Because care must be taken not to reallocate losses from the group companies because it's convenient for the companies. If that is done, there is a risk of a transfer pricing adjustment. But if the reality of the business is that those losses uh, are incurred or are suffered by the subsidiary, and the losses are not pushed from within this group companies, and there are sufficient documents to prove that, of course, that will be considered depending on the factor and circumstances. So generally, it's still the same principles that is followed based on the risk profile of entities within the group and the fact and circumstances of that transaction. So of course, that will depend on what the tax authority, how the tax authority will approach the situation. That is my answer to that.
Thank you very much. I think a few taxpayers will breathe a sigh of relief hearing this also from the Nigerian tax authorities. While talking, Moses made a very important point. He talked about information deficiency. And that brings me to the next issue that I think it will be very important for us to discuss. Now, we understand that from a transfer pricing point of view, taxpayers need to prepare comparability analysis for their contemporaneous TP documentation. Now, where companies need to prepare this documentation, considering the COVID-19 pandemic, there are bound to be some challenges with doing this. Now, Nitin, I think you can give us some insight into this. What are the practical challenges that COVID-19 pandemic poses for conducting this comparability analysis?
Thanks, Bisola. Bisola, firstly, well, the pandemic itself has no comparable. I think the last time we saw was in 1921 or 21, where none of us was alive to see that. Some of us did see, some basis of it in 2008, 2009, when the Great Depression happened, when there was a dip in the IT sector. You know, we were very creative. But then what we saw on the other side was the tax department was also equally creative in coming up with new transfer pricing challenges. So I believe we are back to a situation where it's an unprecedented time. So when the going is so tough, I believe all of us as tough consultants and from the government side will have to have a collective solution towards it. Let me just take you maybe to the basics of it, as Josh has also touched upon it. Data is a new oil. We need data to do TP analysis. In a difficult time, we may need more data. In the pandemic time, we may need more and more data. But how do we assemble it together would be a really important aspect. Even if we see how the OECD has panned out in their discussion, which came up in December, they have given us two keywords. One is what if or but if COVID would have not happened, how the situation would have been. And second is how maybe if I can quote unquote and say a COVID dossier, how can you even prepare a COVID dossier and present it well? So it'll be a lot coming into two aspects there. But even if before we go on to these things, let's look at the basics of it. The basic coming is into data. There are challenges around data would come around two aspects. One, at the time of your maintaining your documentation, and second, if your case is picked up by the tax authorities for an audit. One, when you're looking at it from your challenges at the time of documentation, for the tested party, you will have to take the fiscal year which is under stress under the pandemic. That will be your 2021, and for the comparables, you will take 3-year prior data. Now, these 3-year prior data could be COVID affected and could not be COVID affected depending upon the TP regulations that you have in your country. Well, but even if you take the 3-year, only one would be pandemic affected, the other two would not be. So it'll already even out the impact of pandemic. So you are actually not comparing an apples to apples, at the first go. So it's a tough time for a TP professional who has been harpooning upon apples to apples comparison, and now standing at a situation where he'll may have to color the orange into red and say, this looks like an apple to me, and how closely we can color that, that'll be significant. But looking at it, I'm a fan of a multiple layer data because it actually evens out the usage of multiple layer in a financial data. It helps in capturing the business cycles of the relevant industry by ironing out the normal ups and downs of the industry. And over a 3-year period, than a 1-year period, you get a definitely a better result and a better representation of the industry. So there's no doubt, on the benefit of a multiple year usage for the comparables and as a concept. But the practical challenge would come to fore now, taking specifically an India challenge where the regulations are rigid. They say for the tested party, take the current year data, and for the comparables, take 3-year, that is the current year and 2-year prior. So my hands would be tied here into trying anything flexible. Though I'll be more than happy if the government can issue a circular, or governments where wherever the regulations are such can come up with a support saying, okay, either compare yourself from a 1 year to 1 year, which is both COVID affected, or both of you take 3-year and 3-year, which will help me even out and present the correct picture. But as Josh mentioned, there will be a timeline issue moment you're doing your TP documentation. So do we have the data? So I believe the support that the taxpayers would be looking at would be on two counts. One, on the comparability, and second, can we stretch giving that data at a different date so that we are able to present the right picture. It'll create challenges for countries more like India because we need to give a transfer pricing certificate at the time of filing the return. The transaction are at arm's length. So that'll be a tough challenge into countries wherever such regulations are there. And come think of it, if the governments do not have such guidelines, or we do not have that kind of a support, and OECD does not endorse such computation, then the taxpayers would be significantly inconvenienced and could face undue TP adjustments, which could be inflicted by the deficiencies in the drafting of the law, or something that was not envisaged, than on account of a market reality or an abuse of transfer pricing. There will not be any abuse of transfer pricing, but they could be still facing a lot of litigation. But let it be as it is at the moment, and let's see, in the absence of these guidelines and measures, taxpayer will have to resort to a lot of creative adjustments. They'll have to be creative. One of the few, which I can think of currently is, how about mapping my adjustment to the downward adjustment on the profit margin of the comparables with reference to the projected drop in the GDP maybe of the country, or a projected drop in the industry that would have seen. I'm sure the industry reports would carry these analysis and tell you, okay, the industry has dropped by 6% or 7%. But do I have that kind of data? Will I be able to put that into analysis? Can I go into some kind of a regression analysis? So all these things, yes, would be a challenge, but at least having prescribed TP documentation as per the country regulations, some sophisticated transfer pricing adjustments would have to be there. And in the absence of having any past precedents on how this has been done or how this has been reacted into, there'll be a lot of ifs and buts, when it comes to there. So the challenges are more, rather in this situation currently. The solutions are less, but maybe I would go ahead with some of the approaches that have been envisaged by OECD, saying that if not, the pandemic would have happened. So I'm actually a fan of the line which says, but for COVID test.
Thank you very much
Yeah.
for that meeting. So really, you've highlighted the issues. I don't think there's any need for me to rehash them. Now, the question is, what can taxpayers do? What steps can they take to effectively manage these challenges that meeting has actually highlighted? Kevin, if you can give us some guidelines or some information as to this. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Bisola. Nitin raised a lot of great points just now, and I think it's important to step back because, yes, we're in unprecedented times, but what do we do during a benchmarking exercise? Well, before we go and look at any data, it's important to first define what it is that's going to be benchmarked, right? Defining that which we're going to be claiming some other third-party data, or if it's an external comparable or a relationship with a third party is comparable. And that's got to be because of conditions, not because of outcomes. So let me explain what that means. As Ife and others mentioned earlier, this current time is unprecedented in so many ways. But what's important is understanding the factors that lead to allowing one to claim that a different set of comparables would apply. So, you have to think about it this way. If you go back to Business Plan 101 basics, companies, before they enter a market, a product line or business unit line, they'll do the analytics to determine under what conditions will it make sense to enter the market, the product or the business. Well, by the same token, under these conditions, you almost have to think of it as a business plan to exit a market, under what conditions will you exit a market, will you exit a product line, will you exit a certain business? And it's those types of factors, whatever they are, right? Whatever they are, that you're going to be saying, okay, well, these are the factors that we want to hopefully find comparables for. Now, as you can imagine, this is not going to be on any database, right? Because a lot of this is going to be anecdotal, or it's not necessarily going to be measurable. So what you have here is a situation where you shouldn't be, determining your comparable set necessarily on the outcomes that were reported, because that predetermines what the result is going to be. You should rather be basing your comparability analysis on the conditions that lead to the results. But a lot of that is going to be anecdotal. Now the question is, are the tax authorities going to go along with this? Conceptually, it makes a lot of sense, but this is uncharted territory, so we really don't know. But logically, it makes sense to think about it in terms of how a business would actually tell itself, okay, at what point are conditions so bad, are my financial ratios so bad that I need to think about exiting a certain market, right?
Thank you very much for your comments, Kevin. Josh, if you can just add, if you have any additional points to give us on how to handle these issues, I'm sure taxpayers would also appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bisola. I think Kevin has given us very good insights as to how best to handle this. I'm just going to add a few practical comments. So for one, I think businesses or taxpayers have to be proactive in looking at their related party arrangements. This includes, any intercompany agreements they do have, all right, and how the conduct of those, arrangements in reality is trying to align with those existing agreements. And if there are some misalignments, there's a need, and there might be a need for changes to those agreements, because you want the form of the transaction to align with the substance of the transaction, especially during this pandemic period. And as Moses said earlier on, typically taxpayers did not have, they didn't expect, this extraordinary event to occur. So when they prepared the intercompany agreements in the past, during normal times, they wouldn't have envisaged the adverse impact of pandemic. So taxpayers need to take a look at that. Secondly, we've been very clear about the need for a robust TP documentation. And that also came from Mustafa. It's incumbent on taxpayers that they have a very robust TP documentation. If there's any period that your industry and group company analysis is going to be so important, it's going to be this pandemic period. Because if you're going to argue that there's been an adverse impact on your business because it impacted an industry, then that industry should speak to those challenges. So it cannot be a simple cut and paste or a simple update where you just change some numbers. It needs to be strategic to tell a whole story. So we need to be very robust. The last thing I want to talk about is something that Nathan mentioned that I think it's important that we clarify. When it comes to some of this benchmarking analysis, in some regulations, we are not very clear as to how to do the analysis, whether you're doing a multi-year analysis or a single year analysis. Sometimes it becomes a matter of best practice, but you need to be mindful that depending on the regulations, this can differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. If you take Nigeria, for example, Typically during normal times, we do a 1 year, which is the 1 year financial result of the tested party, against a multi-year for the independent comparables, typically 3 years, to make sure that we've smoothed any volatilities that could have happened due to business cycles. All right. So we've always done 1 year versus multi-year test. Now, in this particular period, if you were doing a financial year 2020 test against a 3-year where you don't have the 2020 financial information for your independent companies, then you know that you're not comparing apples to apples. But it doesn't mean that you should be limited to that, because in the Nigerian regulations, they are not very specific. All right, if you go to US, they actually do a multi-year test. So you do 3 year against 3 years. All right. And the guidance also talks about possibility for 1 year, 1 year. So we need to be very creative about some of this stuff. So that would be my additional comments from a practical point of view. Okay. Bisola, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that, Josh. Thank you for that, Kevin, also. I think it's important we hear from someone that works with the databases that actually helps us get this information we use for comparability analysis. So Solomon, Josh, Nitin, Kevin have talked about issues that arise from conducting comparability analysis and data constraints right now, considering the unprecedented nature of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the question is, how are database service providers responding to the need for more recent information to carry out our various analyses?
Thank you so much, Abisola. First of all, it's a very big challenge. I mean, COVID has presented us as database providers with a very unique challenge in terms of quality of our data. How far can we go into our data? And what recent data is available? How fast can we get that data onto our databases? And now, if I may explain, first of all, what TP database is all about, so that we can be able to understand the basis of how we collate this data and we present it in a uniform format to our users, is that database is basically an external source of data for comparability analysis, in terms of making sure that your arm's length margin is within range. If possible, if it is out of range, then probably need to do adjustments. And why is it out of range? And all those other questions that may arise based on use of our own databases. So essentially, the biggest question that we're getting right now is, do you have data for 2020? Let's look at the dynamics, first of all, at financial data when you're doing a financial-based comparability analysis, when you're doing your PTNMM analysis or your cost plus analysis, and other analysis which require financial data. The thing is that, yes, you may get some data for 2020, 2021, which is just coming in. I was just looking at our system. Some data is coming in, yes. But how do you do a TNMM analysis, or how do you do a cost plus analysis? You need historical data. You need at least 3 years of data going back. This does not cover the COVID period. Whatever data we're getting now is 2020 data, which had COVID at that time, but it's not sufficient to do any financial-based analysis. And some of the data, even which is coming in already, is data from ideally listed companies or companies who are mandated by various regulatory bodies to publish the financials or to be up to speed with the financials. But then how many of them are independent? That's the biggest question. And can they be used for TP? I don't think so. So for TNMM and all cost plus analysis and other financial-based analysis that you need to do your transfer pricing benchmarks, it will be a struggle to get sufficient data. And also another question, which is another issue was raised by Nitin, was how do we use multiple layer data? Indeed, we can use multiple layer data, obviously, for coming up with an analysis, but then will it cover the COVID period? I don't think so. So what are the options which are coming up, and what are the options that we're being asked as database providers to look at in terms of providing? Very interesting questions are coming up about, can we use the 2008, 2009 financial data or periods covering that, the financial slump that we had? Yes, it can be used to some extent when you want to support some analysis, but then was the situation as unique as COVID? Because COVID really messed up a lot of particular industries, especially the hospitality sector, the airline sector, and various other industries like conferences and all that. They were totally messed up. Some of them will never recover. Some of them have had to readjust in terms of how do they do business. Are they going to do a lot of like what we're doing right now? The guys who would facilitate these conferences for us to be there in Nigeria or to be in the Middle East to do these conferences, they're out of business because now what is happening? Anderson Tax is able to do this work. It's not outsourcing the work anymore. So such event providers and all that are out of business, or they have to reconfigure and all those things. And it brings out a lot of issues in terms of how do we get comparables for all this. So how we are able to roll over is that I think, and I'm subject to correction, but based on the numerous clients that we have been discussing with, is that the CAP analysis, or looking at the transactional-based methods, actually can provide a good source of data in terms of assisting with adjustments or assisting with actually providing data for actual benchmarks for which will reflect the impact of the COVID-19 in terms of running businesses, in terms of benchmarks, and in terms of profitability margins and such. Because when you look at transactional-based methods and data, it's actually looking at agreements which have been entered in 2020. Probably some of them are reflecting of the COVID situation. But when we want to look at other financial data to do other analysis, it becomes very difficult. But how do we go about then also using the financial-based methods? I think when you look at the OECD guidelines in terms released on the 18th of 2020, there's a lot of subjectivity which is involved. So we still need to use historical data, but then also transgress that with adjustment, or your margin profitability margins were 3%, and why they have moved all the way to 2% and such things, in terms of corroborating evidence to assist you in, like, this is how we transit and all that. Because the only time we'll only get data which will be sufficient to support the financial-based analysis is probably 2 years from now, because we have to get data from sources which are official. There's another interesting question which I got the other day whereby some client was asking, but we have data, we can see it online and all that. The question is that data, we cannot use it because it's not an official source of data that we can rely on. Because remember, when we get data and we put it onto the database, it's a non-reversible process. Because some of our clients are going to use that data and they cannot go back in terms of saying, no, this data was wrong and all that. We cannot withdraw that data. And that's obviously because of other technical issues which are associated with uploading that data. But then it cannot be like we put the wrong data onto the database, so sorry, we are removing it. It doesn't work like that. That just fizzles out the authenticity of your database. So we have to get data from official sources whereby you can use our names, royalty range. You say this data was this margin was this, and we're able to support it. We're able to go back to anywhere else and we're able to indeed authentify where we got our data. So basically, that's just in a nutshell, talking about our databases and how we'd collect the data and how long we'd expect the span to be. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Solomon. So if I could just reiterate, what you're saying is that because of issues, data constraints with getting information on these databases, taxpayers may need to look at the guidelines and find creative ways to actually pass adjustments using the available information. And also going back to what Josh and Mustafa mentioned, it would be good to keep every supporting documentation that taxpayers have used in their analysis today, to ensure that in the case of an audit or an investigation in the future, they're able to explain what happens during this period and why they had to pass those adjustments. So thank you very much for your comments, Solomon. Now, we've talked a lot about comparability analysis, but I think it's also important to highlight, to talk about something that one of our panelists mentioned earlier during discussions, talked about the fact that the changes in the economy have affected business in such a way that some companies may actually end up being loss-making. Now, the question is, when it comes to related party transactions, considering the impact of COVID-19, can entities in a limited risk arrangement incur losses during this period? How will these losses be treated, considering the peculiarities of limited risk arrangements? Kevin, if you can help us answer this question, we'd really appreciate that.
Sure, thank you, Basola. The short answer is yes, but it's a conditional yes, of course. It's a transfer pricing, right? It always depends. So when the top line, the revenue line has fallen so significantly, so dramatically, like it has over the past year, you're going to get a distortion in all of your PLI, your profit level indicator ratios, right? So what are the common limited risk arrangements? There's captive services, whether for sales and marketing, R&D, or management services. There's contract manufacturing, and then there's some form of like limited risk distribution. In all cases, you can imagine, you can come up with examples where uh, the, the, the party in question that would otherwise be held to a limited risk result is actually having to indirectly bear the risk. Why is that? Because even though, so let's take it from a logical standpoint first, even though you may be a captive service provider, limited risk distributor, contract manufacturer, you're sheltered from risk, right? That's the theory under the transfer pricing framework. You're sheltered from risk by the principal within the group. However, that only works so long as the principal and the group is solvent and has cash to share, right? You indirectly bear risk by choosing to be a member of the group, theoretically. So if the group faces a solvency crisis, you're not going to be immune from that. And so that's the reality we're confronting right now. So what are some examples? How would you approach this analytically if you're the taxpayer, if you're a tax authority? Well, you would expect if you're talking about a captive service operation, all the reference points should be made to the labor market because that's the condition to which that informs how much is paid to the service provider. So you can come up with examples of where if there's slack in the economy and there's high unemployment, that's going to have a depressing effect on the markups. It may also lead to layoffs and reductions in force. If we're talking about contract manufacturing, if it's an asset intensive, heavy manufacturing operation, if there's a downturn, you're going to get a real distortion in, let's say, the return on asset, if that's being used as the PLI, right? Because the top line, the revenue is going to fall, but the asset, that the asset line is a balance sheet item. That's not going to vary. It's not going to flex according to market conditions, right? But the revenue line will. So if the PLI for a manufacturer is based on something that uses a balance sheet as a denominator, but income statement item for the numerator, well, you're going to get a distortion. Limited risk distributor or any kind of distributor. A limited risk distributor, this is one you probably want to think about the most because it's what comes up, the most often. But a limited risk distributor characterization is usually, not always, but usually put in place because it's implicitly assumed that the level of effort required by the distributor will fairly stably result in revenue, right? That's why it's called a return on sales. It also implicitly assumes that the distributor doesn't need to have that much effect on the price. Rather, the structure is set up really because it's rewarding the distributor on the units sold, return on sales. But what if you have a situation where you have a product market that requires a long lead time for production and it's a high-priced item? Well, there could be a big distortion from the time the production decision is made and later on when the item is sold. And if during that time period, the prices for the product have fallen, have crashed. You see that a lot in heavy manufacturing. So like steel production, for example, companies are sitting on inventory that they made production decisions about when the inputs were at a high cost, but now they can't sell it for the same cost because the ratios, right? The ratios have become distorted. So in that case, the question is who bears the responsibility for the production decision? Was it entirely by the group principal, by the manufacturer, or did the distributor have a role in making that decision? If it played a role, then you would think that it should be allocated some portion of the loss that results. So, these are just examples, but I think the main point is it gets to things that Josh was saying and Nitin was saying earlier on, which is that, you really have to tie the specifics about how the business operates and persuasively, conclusively show that there's no other result, that could be possible. There's no ambiguity. Either you apply this non-arm's length result, or what might otherwise be considered non-arm's length in normal conditions, or somehow the business becomes insolvent and members have to leave. I mean, it has to be that severe. Right? So I don't know. I hope that answers the question, or addresses it.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Your comments have made it very clear that it will be probably on a case-by-case basis. We have to look at the validity of such limited risk arrangements, considering the peculiarities of the pandemic. Now, considering these issues, now the question is, how does the tax authority, or how do the tax authorities plan to treat these entities, considering they have a very unique, peculiar arrangement? Mustafa, if you can tell us, give us an insight into how tax authorities would treat limited risk entities to go a long way.
Yeah, thank you very much. The idea of limited risk distribution, I believe, is sometimes it is overemphasized. Now, the way I look at this issue is to say, the way I look at this issue is to say that it depends, because it depends on the facts and circumstances of the case. So if you look at the way the guideline put it, the guideline talks about losses generally, and also talks about the fact that it is possible for, under limited circumstances, for a low functioning entity to make a loss. But if you look at the way the UN Practical Manual put it, the UN Practical Manual actually looks at it from the point of view of the principal and the agent in terms of entrepreneurial risk. So, although the UN manual did not actually talk about pandemic, but they talked about, risk under drastic economic shock like recession, which is similar to the economic circumstances related to the pandemic. So the conclusion there is to say that because the limited risk distribution is at the lower end of the value chain, it's generally not an entrepreneur, so it's not expected to bear the consequences of a major hazard risk like an entrepreneurial risk related to a shock like the pandemic shock. But having said that, it's also possible under limited circumstances, but it depends on the overall risk allocation within the group. So I'll give you an example. If, for instance, pre-pandemic, you have a manufacturer in a different jurisdiction that supplies into Nigeria by using distributors, Nigerian distributors that has low functions. It's not engaged in so much of intangibles like brand development. So it's expected to be a low function distributor. For pre-pandemic, where things are good, where the profit margins within the value chain was quite robust, the manufacturer who takes most of the entrepreneurial decisions and bears most of the significant risk actually takes a lot of margin from the group. And then, of course, allocates limited returns through intercompany pricing of this product, the limited risk distributor, if you like, because I am not a fan of those terminologies, limited, full-fledged. So in that circumstance, post a good period during the pandemic, when there's a shock and then there's a decline in demand or disruption in supply chain that's affected the margins in terms of lower sales and fixed costs that could not be shared due to lower revenues. That means that there's a drop in margin from within the group. So in that situation, it is not expected that the loss will be disproportionately shared with the limited risk distributor, because it is expected that they would not bear these consequences of this kind of significant risk. So therefore, I would not expect the Nigerian distributor to take so much of the heat. So the documentation by the taxpayer will have to provide such justification if the taxpayer receives such a loss. So there has to be justification pre-pandemic and during the pandemic of how these economic circumstances affect the companies within the value chain. So it's not a straightforward answer. But what we have seen practically is that even pre-pandemic, we see a lot of taxpayers giving us losses on their contractual arrangements and their documentation on their distribution arrangements. So you don't have a lot of contract manufacturers in Nigeria because it's not generally competitive. The companies do not have competitive advantage to build in contract manufacturing plants in Nigeria. So what you have is mostly distributions. So what we see is that these distributors declaring losses and based on wrong classification of functions, even though they could be seen as limited risk, but they usually come up with losses which we usually result in adjustments. But having said that, the taxpayer has to be careful whether or not to be exposed to audit adjustments if their risk classification does not align to the overall group contribution and expectation of profit and losses. So it's about how the risks are shared within the group and how the profit expectation or loss expectation can be evidenced within the group. That will depend on how the tax authority will accept the characterization of that entity. So I think that will be my short answer.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. It's very clear that this can be a quite controversial issue. But the point is, we look at it on the facts and circumstances of each taxpayer and determine what to do in line with the guidance. Another major thing that I think we need to highlight while we're in this session is related party arrangements and how the pandemic could have created situations where there might be a need to modify your already available arrangements. Branjit, if you can just help us in a few minutes, can just talk about what circumstances or under what circumstances can related party arrangements be modified to address the issues caused by the pandemic?
Sure. Thank you. So, we would have certain scenarios which we could look at modifying the arrangements, but let's focus on two specific scenarios which is focused by OECD. The first one is about the payment terms, and second one being on the pricing arrangement. Now, to understand this better, I would use an example. Let's assume we have a mobile manufacturer based in China, for which the distributor is located in UAE. These both entities are related party transactions, where the distributor has two customers, which is based in Europe. Now, as a part of this, transaction, buy and sell between the related party and independent transaction, the customer one purchase at the normal pricing, which is agreed on, whereas the second customer purchased the products, the mobiles. However, he delays the payment. So let's assume the payment terms would have been at 30-day payment terms. Now, the second customer being a major customer for the distributor, he delays the payment, by which the distributor is hit with his cash flow. And second, he also carries the credit risk. So when you have this comparable, transaction with an independent party, which is the customer two, the, arrangement between the China manufacturer and the distributor can be looked at to be renegotiated. And that's one area which the OECD, guidance has focused on, to say that for a payment term, the related party transaction can renegotiate with a comparable transaction with the customer too. So it's not limited to from payment terms. They've also gone to an extent to explain about the pricing of the arrangement. Now, under this second scenario, if the distributor has a risk of losing a customer, big customer, due to the pricing, wherein the customer asks for a major discount in the pricing, and which leads to the business risk of a distributor, the distributor and the manufacturer, being a related party members, could look at revisiting, or renegotiating the pricing arrangement between them. Under both these transactions, the important point to be noted is that these renegotiation has to be done at number one, at the arm's length principle. And second, you should have an evidence for a comparable transaction with an independent party. And third, these evidence should be documented to ensure that you have base to do a renegotiation of these transactions. So these are the two areas that the OECD has focused on, which can be considered by the taxpayers with adequate documentation in place.
Thank you very much for that, Ranjit. So taxpayers can update their agreements, but there are certain things they have to look out for in updating those agreements. Now, so continuing our discussion about updating about agreements, I know that there's usually a force majeure clause in an agreement. Now, Jackie, I know you're a lawyer, you have a law background. I think you can help us to actually understand, considering the pandemic, when can the force majeure clauses be activated, considering the impact of this pandemic, and how will this affect the conduct of related party transactions?
Okay, well, this is a topic one could go on all afternoon about, so I'm going to try and keep it very, very short. It's always factual, number one. And the overriding thing to consider is, what would independent parties acting at arm's length do? How would they act in terms of a force majeure clause? As we know, force majeure clause, if it's correctly drafted, may be used to release or suspend obligations of either one of the parties in terms of a contract. It's incredibly important to understand that a force majeure clause contemplates an absolute inability to perform, as opposed to a relative inability to perform. Now, by that I mean it's not going to work if a party says, well, it's difficult to perform or it's inconvenient to perform. That is not what a force majeure clause contemplates. It has to be an absolute inability. Now, when lockdown hit us a year ago, and a number of my partners in the firm, all they did was generate basically force majeure opinions, it became very evident that not all force majeure clauses are created equal. Some were simply drafted too narrowly to include COVID. So they would deal with acts, they would deal with wars and strikes and floods and earthquakes. But there was not a catch-all provision that would deal with a COVID type scenario. So that was the first thing to bear in mind. So one needs to understand, why can't a particular party perform? And then it became very evident in South Africa, and I'm sure this sort of thought process played itself out everywhere else in the world. If one takes, for instance, a contract between a supplier and the recipient of the goods. So the supplier has to supply the goods. The recipient of the goods, he expects to receive his goods, and he will need to pay for those goods. Where one got to in the legal analysis was, assuming one had a correctly wide enough drafted force majeure clause, the supplier could potentially invoke and trigger the force majeure clause, because we had a hard lockdown. So manufacturing plants could not operate. Ships could not dock in the port with the goods. That is what the force majeure clause contemplated. With regard to the recipient of those goods and the party that had to pay for them, one one sort of ended up in a rather anomalous situation where the recipient of the goods, the fact that he couldn't pay or had cash flow problems, or it was less easy for him to find the cash to pay, actually was not necessarily an event that would trigger a force majeure clause or allow him to invoke that clause. One's actually dealing with an insolvency event potentially. And it became quite tricky then, depending on which party one was acting for. So the fact that it's inconvenient to pay is not, or more difficult to pay, is not an absolute ability or inability to perform in terms of that contract. Then in terms of the clauses, if one would want to, so one needs to bear that in mind in terms of invoking and triggering a force majeure clause in a connected party situation. The other thing to consider as well in these clauses is what are the requirements? Certain of them contain requirements like specific notifications that have to be made. There needs to be an attempted mitigation. Certain time periods play out. And the thing about all of those factors, if one's going to seek to rely on a force majeure clause, is those conversations need to have happened a year ago, not necessarily now when a year end is upon us and one's having to sort of put one's returns in and put one's documentation together. One can't necessarily seek to invoke a force majeure clause now. They should have been invoked and triggered a year ago. So I think that sort of documentary process of what has happened, if in a connected party context, one's seeking to rely on trigger this clause, one needs to have the timeline of what's happened in the past year, when it was triggered, who triggered it, was there an absolute inability to perform, and one needs to document that whole process, including, I would say it's safe to say that the margins should have been stress tested along the way on every point of the year. As you go into hard lockdown, come out of lockdown, go back into lockdown, it may well have been useful to sort of stress tested your margins along that timeline. The other question, and I know I'm running out of time, the other question to ask is, if I don't have a force majeure clause, does that mean I can't, rely on the sort of year that we've had being COVID driven? And there are common law common law remedies in terms of supervening impossibility that one could consider. But again, that is going to be very fact driven and very industry driven. So yeah, I think it's safe to say going forward, there's going to be a whole new industry in drafting force majeure clauses tailored to epidemics, not just wars and floods and earthquakes.
So more work for you lawyers, Jackie.
Well, yeah, maybe.
That's very
but it's not as easy as one thinks to necessarily invoke the clause and to trigger a force majeure. So the fact that the clause is in a contract doesn't mean you're over the line.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Thank you for your comments, Jackie. I really wish we could have more time to discuss. This has been a very engaging, very interesting, technically superior webinar, but unfortunately, our time is fast spent. So we're rounding up now, but I think I'd just like to hear from Josh as part of our closing remarks, considering that our time is very fast spent. Josh, what advice would you have to businesses? What steps would you tell them to take to address all these issues that we have discussed, all these issues that have been raised by the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Bisola. I think it's very obvious that we are dealing with uncertain issues and uncertain times, and there's a need for businesses to take this seriously. This is something that is synonymous with almost every presentation I've made on transfer pricing. I always talk about proactivity, and I'm going to stress this again. Businesses have to be highly proactive during these uncertain times. What does that mean? First and foremost, every business that has related party transactions should think about having some kind of health check to assess the potential implications of COVID-19 on their transfer pricing issues. So that health check will basically throw up issues, some of the issues we've talked about, so that it can put in place some mitigating actions in terms of how do I mitigate some of these transfer pricing exposures that have been heightened because of COVID-19. And once you do that and you start implementing those mitigating actions, then you reduce your transfer pricing exposure. So this is very critical. Secondly, I will appeal to the tax administrators who've been on this panel and those who are listening, that these are uncertain times, and there's a reason why OECD had to come up with this guidance, which included 137 countries from the inclusive framework. So we need to be very open-minded about some of the positions we've taken during normal times and recognize that, look, we need, there should be creative ways to actually prove that taxpayers have met the arm's length principle. So those would be my comments. But once again, I thank everybody who made time out of their very busy schedule to be part of this panel. We wish we had more time to talk about some of these issues in much more detail. But hopefully businesses will be proactive, tax administrators will be more receptive, there'll be more clarity, and there'll be win-win for both parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh, for those closing remarks. And just to round up, I think everything that we've discussed here today, there are two keywords that come to mind: flexibility and adaptability. Like someone mentioned, we've never had a situation like this COVID-19 pandemic. So in desperate times like this, people need to understand the peculiarities of the situation and be flexible, be adaptable in carrying out their related party analysis. I would really like to thank everyone that joined this session, our audience. I understand that there are some questions in the question and answer box. We will respond to these questions and publish it on our social media platforms. Thank you very much for taking out your time for and listening to us. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to Anderson. We are very willing and very open to answering your questions. To our panelists, we're really appreciative of you taking out your time. I know it's not easy, different people in different time regions, but thank you for taking your time out to enrich us with these discussions. And also, we hope that you would answer us next time that we call you in case we have another webinar. So I would like to say again, a very big thank you to everybody that worked to ensure that this webinar was a success. Thank you all for your behind the scenes work. It's deeply appreciated. The last thing, just to remind the general audience, we are now Anderson. We are no longer Anderson Tax. So we have an expanded, expanded service offerings, business advisory services. We provide private client services also. So please feel free to reach us for your business advisory needs and for your private client needs. Once again, I am Abisola Agola. It has been a pleasure being the moderator of this event. Thank you very much and have a good day.